signal. And we are live on YouTube. Enjoy your session. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this session on sustainable and just economies, lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis and enabling factors for the SDGs. Welcome, happy you are all joining us on this session that has a duration of 1.5 hours, and I have here for you a whole set of speakers from different organizations, and let me present them to you. First of all, Mustafa Kamal Guy, who is leading the work on green jobs and just transition at the International Labour Organization. Welcome, Mustafa Guy. Isabel Kempf, the head of the Bonn office and senior research coordinator at the UN Research Institute for Social Development. Welcome, Isabel, glad you're joining, who is accompanied by Dunja Krause, research officer at the UN Research Institute for Social Development. Welcome, Dunja. Charlotte Portier, the manager of international policy at the Global Reporting Initiative. Welcome, Charlotte. Shamista Selvaratnam, research analyst at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Hi, Shamista. Elena Bodvina, Economics Affairs Officer at the Division of Investment and Enterprises at UNCTAD. Hello, Elena. Constanza Pauciulo, Program Officer at International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. Constanza, welcome. Senas Kimas, Coordinator of the Women's Major Group. Griet Katert, Head of Labour Rights at the UN Global Compact. So those are the speakers for today. My name is Linda Dalen from the International Training Center of the ILO, and I will facilitate you through this session. What we have in mind for you is, first of all, a little introduction by the ILO on the just transition. Then we have a panel discussion of about 30 minutes on the same topic. Then we would like to present you some of the tools that the institutions that are online with us have developed in relation to this topic. And at the end of the 1.5 hour, we hope to have a discussion with you, with the participants. You can speak directly or write on the chat on all of the topics that you will have heard and that you're curious maybe about to hear more. So what is the topic today? You're all aware that the COVID-19 crisis and the economic impact of what some would call the Great Lockdown has both highlighted the urgency of the 2030 agenda, but also threatened to roll back progress made since 2015 on this agenda. Now, ensuring that the recovery points towards a development model that delivers a triple bottom line of prosperity, planet and people in light of the global pandemic requires coordinated and well-integrated policies to maximize opportunities for more and better jobs, for social inclusion, for social justice. Consultation among the main stakeholders of the world of work is instrumental to achieve consensus and respect for labor rights, and to ensure that no one is left behind during the transition towards sustainable and just economies. So action is needed to support the 2030 vision of an equal and sustainable world, as well as renewed commitment from government and business to ensure transparency, accountability, and clarity of decision-making, as well as to align efforts towards a just, people-centered recovery during the decade of action to talk about today. And without further introductions, I would like to invite our first speaker, Mustafa Kamal Gai, Global Coordinator of the Green Jobs Program of the International Labour Organization, to give us an introduction. Mustafa, what is that just transition? And how do just transition policies, including social dialogue including social dialogue, enable green economy development? And I will share the screen from my end here with your presentation. Mustafa, you have the floor, and I hope you can all see this presentation. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Linda. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, colleagues. First of all, it's a pleasure to be joining you in this session. On behalf of the International Labour Office, I would like to express our appreciation to UNITAR and UNDESA for convening this event in the context of the high-level political forum. Linda, on the next slide, first message I would like to convey is that a key lesson we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is that a healthy life and a workplace and productive economies depend on a healthy environment. Now, from the world of work perspective, sustainability is critical for two main reasons. The first is that it is important to promote decent work for all, and this is at the core of the mandate of the ILO. Not less than 1.2 billion jobs are closely linked to ecosystems and the services that ecosystems provide. For example, if our fishery stock collapses, it's not less than 85 million jobs that will be at risk. And second, to advance social justice. We are aware of the impacts that environmental damage impact those within our societies that are mostly vulnerable. For example, indigenous and tribal peoples and people already in poverty situations tend to rely more on ecosystem services for their survival than others. And what we see today is the context of moving towards a low carbon economy. And this implies something close to a structural transformation of the scale of what we have seen in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And in the next point, this concerns all economic sectors, from manufacturing to fisheries to transportation and the service industries in general. So that was the image, Linda, on the next point. And then I move to my second message, which is that environmental damage and the climate crisis that we see today and likely to amplify in the future will endanger working lives as much as COVID-19 does today. In the ILO, when we measured the number of working life years that have been lost as a consequence of human-induced or climate change-related disasters just between the year 2000 and 2015, we find that it's not less than 23 million working life years that have been lost. And this is distributed in an unequal fashion. As we can see, some regions will be more impacted and have been already more impacted than others, in particular Asia and the Pacific, and countries in Africa and in the Americas. And my third point here is that climate change is, I mean, that's the third, the next slide, please. Climate change will impact negatively on labor productivity. We have taken data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on heat stress, which results from the mere fact of the warming of the planet. And we've tried to turn that loss in economic value into a loss of working time in terms of labor productivity as a way of measuring impacts on labor productivity. And what we find is that even going with an optimistic scenario of 1.5 degree of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, with current patterns of warming of the planet, by the year 2030, an average of 2.2% of total working hours around the world are going to be lost. Now, this is equivalent to 80 million full-time jobs. And you'll see again that it is distributed unequally across world regions. For example, Southern Asia, Western Africa would be much more impacted than other regions, where the impact would be a loss of working hours close to 5%, both in Southern Asia and Western Africa. Now, this 5% of working time loss in Southern Asia is close to 10 million full-time jobs. And that's the same in the context of West Africa. Now, not only is it a loss in terms of labor productivity, there are critical implications in terms of occupational safety and health that have to be taken into account. Now, in the next slide, I would like to say that we are not totally on a blank picture. When we looked at the way in which through which climate change and the response measures will affect employment, we find that this will happen in different ways. Pursuing a 2-degree target as put forward in the Paris Agreement on Climate Change is taking us on a positive narrative. We're going to see job creation, at least in the energy sector, which is a net job gain in the order of 18 million jobs. But what we see also is that some world regions will see gains in employment. That's the case for Asia Pacific, for the Americas, for Europe, and for the world as a whole. However, other regions are likely to see a decline in employment. That will be the case in the Middle East and in parts of Africa. And this loss of employment and the job creation result from two main factors: a reallocation of employment away from fossil fuels towards other alternative sources of energy, and this is the path of the Paris Agreement. But we also see in the context of the mining and the extractive industry a growth in the extraction of material, for example, inputs that will be needed in for electrical vehicles, for renewable energy generation, will see a growth, but extraction of fossil fuels will decline. So that leaves us with job creation in some parts of the world, but displacement of employment on the others. But I would like to end with a positive message that for the world as a whole, it is a net job gain. And the message here is that it's not action against climate change, but rather inaction that will cause massive disruption in the world of work. Now, the next message, the next point is that in the next slide, because of these different types of impact on the world of work, the notion of just transition is fundamental. We need to find ways to minimize the disruption in our economies and societies on the one hand, and maximize the economic and social gains on the other as we pursue an ecological transition. And this is why in 2015, the IO tripartite constituents made of representatives of governments, employers, and workers' organizations have come together and collectively put forward what is called a set of guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. These guidelines are critical. They give us a unique guiding framework where policy coherence is encouraged so that the agenda to advance the ecological transition is put together with social and economic policies, institutional arrangement that brings together all different parts of government and society. And the guidelines emphasize social dialogue, which means that it is essential to build a social consensus among all actors of society as an indispensable element to raise the ambition for climate action in a way that also addresses its indispensable and unavoidable social consequences. There are 9 policy areas in these guidelines, ranging from macroeconomic to enterprise policies, occupational safety and health, social protection, and the guidelines give recommendations in terms of what labor market policies could be deployed together with environmental and climate policies for a just transition for all. Now, these are all important, but I would like to just zoom in the next slide on two important areas. The one I would like to emphasize is skills for a just transition. What we see today is an important degree of skills mismatch between the ambition that governments have put on the environment side and the building of a human workforce to make that possible. So we find that only few countries have assessed the skills they need for their ecological transition, have identified and developed skills that allow them to bridge the gaps, and this is important. Now, there are many actors involved in this process, companies, workers, governments, training providers, and that means that this is a complicated process, but it is important to have all these actors on board in a coordinated manner. The second element of the guidelines I would like to emphasize is social protection for a just transition. There will be unavoidable damage. There will be loss of jobs, loss of income. If we do not build a climate regime that integrates social protection, where we can provide an employment benefit, where there will be loss of jobs and income, where we can allow for an early retirement for workers that are at an advanced age and risk losing their jobs, but not be able to be redeployed in any other occupations because of age or other factors, and consider cash transfers that can be made in a flexible way and allow for groups that would be impacted to secure some income. If we do not do that, we risk creating a powerful force of social opposition that will bring down the climate agenda and ambition. And I think that has been seen already in the past few years in a number of countries through people going to the streets. So I'd like to end just with a slide that is about an initiative that the UN Secretary General had announced during the climate summit of 2019, which is a Clean Jobs Initiative. We call it also the Climate Action for Jobs Initiative. It is an initiative to advance climate action, decent work, and a just transition for all, taking into account the context of the changing world with a COVID-19 pandemic that we are in. We look forward to engaging with all of you in taking forward the climate action for jobs so that we scale up climate ambition and do that in a way that puts jobs and livelihoods at the center of this action. And that will be a way to achieve a just transition for all. Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the attention. Linda, thank you, and over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Mustafa Kamal Guy from the International Labour Organization, to give us this introduction of the just transition, to give us some key data, and to set the scene for this afternoon that we have with you. Thank you so much. I see there is also already some activity on the chat. There are some people raising hands, and I will be very strict on time with the next speaker so that we do have time at the end of this session to respond to your questions and to your comments. I will now proceed inviting our panelists for a 30-minute panel on the topic of today with UNRIST, Isabel Kempf and Dunja Krause. Hi, if you can put on your video, please. With UN Global Compact, Griet Kattaert, and with the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific's Constanza Parchulo, and a women's major group represented by Senas Kimas. Welcome to this panel. And you have heard Mustafa Kamal Guy from the ILO giving the introduction on the just transition, what it means to the world of work. I would first of all want to give the floor to Isabel Kempf. from the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development. Can you tell us a little bit more, what does a just transition mean for from a broad policy framework? How can the wider political economy framework be integrated into a development model that delivers a triple bottom line of prosperity, planet and people in the light of the COVID-19 crisis? Isabel, Dunja, please.
Yes, I will actually be the one to start. If
Excellent.
You can, allow me to share the screen. I think you need to turn off your slides.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda, and also thank you, Mustafa, for setting the scene for us today. At UNRIST, we conduct research and policy analysis on the social dimensions of contemporary development challenges. And the climate crisis is, of course, one of the very prominent ones, which is now being kind of intermeddled with the whole COVID situation and post-COVID context. One of the initiatives that we have launched at UNRIST is the Just Transition Research Collaborative, where we looked exactly at kind of the social dimensions of one kind of particular concept that deals with climate change. And what we did there is try to map out how just transition is actually being proposed and discussed in different contexts. And I think one of the things I just wanted to highlight here is the origins of the concept of just transition, which lie in the North American labor movement, who basically aimed to link environmental and labor market policies and really wanted to counter this narrative that we hear so often, that you have to choose between the environment or jobs, and that it's kind of difficult or almost impossible to do both. So it was really an initiative that came from the labor movement, from the trade unions, to promote decarbonization while protecting workers. And I think that's important to note right now, because through the work of these trade unions, but also, of course, organizations like the ILO and others, the concept has been promoted at a much broader and much more international scale. And that led to its spread to a much broader range of constituencies and stakeholders who are now taking it up and kind of coming up with their own ideas around just transition, promoting a plethora of different approaches and proposals, which is important because also to acknowledge that there are many different varieties of just transition, because they differ in the levels of ambition and in the justice implications. And so what we did is we kind of tried to look at different approaches from different parts of the world and try to group them a little bit according to what they were trying to achieve. What we found was that you really have kind of a whole range of issues, starting from kind of those initiatives that try to protect a certain status quo for workers that will be affected by a structural transformation. So there you have your fairly narrowly defined, of course, still important compensation of those people who are losing jobs in a certain industry that is supposed to be shut down or that is in decline. But you also have some that are more looking for a managerial reform type of approach, where you enhance workers' rights. You really try to kind of include social protection. You tackle the distribution of benefits and costs in a just transition. And going on from there, we find also that many approaches are now also trying to promote a more structural reform. So there you have still, you always have all these levels, like you have the compensation, you have the kind of workers' rights, distribution of benefits, but you also try to kind of make the entire process more inclusive and equitable. So there you're also tackling, in addition, questions of decision-making and procedural justice. So who is actually kind of in the driving seat, if you will, in designing the policies that are being promoted and put forward. And then kind of at the most ambitious end, from a really broad perspective, you have groups and activists who are kind of promoting a just transition with a vision of kind of a fundamental overhaul of the existing political economy. And you have calls for kind of eco-social justice, and they're really trying to do things differently. So that's kind of an important point, because what we're trying to assess is, okay, what does just transition mean in the current context, but also how can just transition be transformative? And how can it kind of contribute not only to decarbonization, but also to kind of the achievement of the SDGs and other kind of bring about co-benefits, right? So what we see there is that we found kind of the most transformative approaches mostly at the local level. There are still kind of relatively small initiatives. One example would be Corporation Jackson in Mississippi in the US, who are kind of promoting a just transition as like a call for sort of a post-carbon future, but also linking it to calls for solidarity economy, more cooperative-led economy, and self-determination, especially for people of African descent. So they're really kind of trying to overcome a lot of inbuilt injustices in the current system. And they're trying to promote just transition really for the entire community and kind of moving towards a different vision of the future. And I think for us, it was important to look at all of these variations of just transition to kind of understand how the concept can sometimes be appropriated by certain actors who are looking for like maybe an excuse to slow down decarbonization because they say, oh, but we have to tackle justice, or by others again who are kind of pushing for a certain agenda. And
yeah, just not to interrupt you, but there's a request if you could speak a little louder. Thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. But just to say that I think the most important point for us is that just transition can be transformative if it brings people together in the struggle for decarbonization and equity. So rather than dividing people, playing groups out against each other in fear of losing their livelihoods and jobs, it should kind of really bring them together in a joint struggle, right? And kind of bring different groups together to really kind of keep in mind this idea that you can link the environment and jobs, and that it doesn't have to be either or. So I think that reflects also well with the ILO idea of social dialogue and really bringing different constituencies together. So I think the COVID context now, if we look at that, and I'll hand over to Isabel in just a moment, is especially relevant because we currently have not just the climate crisis and certain sectors that are kind of high carbon emitting sectors that are struggling, but we have people in a lot of different sectors really struggling and fearing loss of their livelihoods. We have seen brought to light basically that there are a lot of problems in our existing systems that we kind of knew of, that people in some healthcare sectors are not really in good working conditions. People in these, you know, in the agriculture have very difficult working conditions, people in certain factories, etc. We've known all of that, but the COVID context, of course, brings these things into a new light. And also, I think, call for different approaches to tackle with things in a more integrated manner. And I hand over to Isabel with the question whether COVID can be a catalyzer of change.
Right. Thank you so much, Dunja, and hello to all participants. Yes, I think, you know, the COVID crisis, as Dunja said, has really raising everyone's awareness and brought to light the existing inequalities and discrimination within the system. But there are also some positives. You know, I think what makes this crisis different, let's say from the 2008 financial crisis, that now we have technology for decarbonization, which we might not have had before. It's available. There is a very high level of trust in government now as an effective actor. I think according to the Edelman barometer, for example, it's over 65% worldwide, the trust in government. And also it's at the highest level, I think, since World War II. So very high level of trust in the government measures. And we have seen that a lot of is possible if there's political will and trust. And then also the increased awareness of the interlinkages between environment, nature, and society. And also, of course, about the interconnectivity amongst nations and people worldwide. And more, we also see demands for transformation rising. You know, we have increased demands for climate change, racial equality, and decent work. These have all become a part of the post-COVID crisis discussion. We want to build back better or build forward better, as we would like to see it. And that is really can be done if we agree on an integrated agenda. And there's an integrated agenda needs to be also translating into integrated policies. Next slide, please. So, we all know that we have an integrated agenda with the SDGs. And that is really important to have one agenda, a single development agenda, because I think the Yellow Vest and other movements that Mustafa has been referring to show that, if you try to clean up now and redistribute benefits later, that will not work. Before we had grow first and then clean up later. So we had, during the last 4 or 5 decades, I think there was a different focus, either on economic growth or on redistribution or now on the green. And we have seen that only concentrating on one doesn't work. So really the idea to have a policy coherence, to have integrated policies, and then to have a really integration both at the vertical and the horizontal level, meaning, both intersectional policies, but also kind to make sure that, policies are coherent from national level to regional level to district and local level. And that has been often difficult because, for example, in decentralization processes, sometimes budgets have not been decentralized, whereas the agenda has been decentralized to region and local level, but the money did often not follow. And there's also the question of, how can we show priorities and interconnections within budgets and policies. And I think there are some interesting examples. For example, there's the Fonerva Fund in Rwanda, which includes climate change and poverty in a fund that then directs funds to local government and also community and NGO initiatives, such as Green Villages. There is a fund in Mauritius, or Maurice Île Durable, to really make sure that the green projects at local level can be financed through government and private financing. There are green bonds in Indonesia. So I think there are kind of a number of initiatives that have shown that it's possible to kind of have that coherence between policies, budgets, and then also expenditure and new investments. So I think it's really important to kind of share those experiences as much as possible. And that's one of the things that UNRIST as a research institute is doing. And then we have the importance of social dialogue. And I think Mustafa already eloquently described why that's important. Because of course, policy coherence is closely linked to good governance. And it's really important to address economic, social, and environmental issues within a single agreed upon agenda, so that you have the trust and the support and the real participation of all your citizens. So I think that's a little bit on the need for integrated approaches. And then we would like just to share a few additional resources from UNRIST. As Dunya already said, we have this publication on just transitions, so different country experiences with just transitions, and then also a number of kind of other sides to it, for example, just transition and businesses, and then also the whole idea a little bit, what does a just transition look like, and what are the different stages of just transition. So you're welcome to have a look, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Isabel Kempf, Dunya Krause from the UN Research Institute for Social Development. Thank you for those inputs. I'm going to move on, and we're really happy to have Griet Kataert with us in this panel from UN Global Compact. Griet.
Hi.
Hi, Griet. It is a very challenging time for business.
Yeah,
And
indeed.
in a way, UN Global Compact represents business. The COVID-19 pandemic has created an unprecedented global disruption also for business. For most companies, business continuity and even business survival are now the #1 focus. My question to you, how can we ensure that they don't lose sight of the need to implement 2030 agenda commitments? And can you maybe share some examples of businesses, COVID-19 responses from businesses that contribute to the SDGs? You have the floor, Greet.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, Linda, for moderating this session, and also to the organizers to invite the Global Compact to be participating in this discussion. Maybe just very briefly, who the Global Compact is. We are the world's largest corporate social sustainability initiative. It's a call to companies to align their strategies and their policies with universal principles on human rights, on labor rights, on environment, and on anti-corruption. There are 10 universal principles that all our companies are aligning to. We have at this moment 10,000 participating companies within the Global Compact, and we have 68 local networks all over the world. So it's a call to align their policies to these principles, but also to take actions to advance the SDGs. The Global Compact is celebrating this year its 20th anniversary. 20 years ago, it was Kofi Annan who launched the initiative to bring really business together with the UN. So we really wanted to bring these two stakeholders, these two worlds together, and also to give what he said, to give a human face to the global trade. So I would just like to give an overview of what the Global Compact is doing now during these times, and what, because as you said, it's a very challenging time for business. Most of the companies are indeed just focusing for now on the health and safety of their own employees. It's about business continuity and business survival even. But I think it's very important that we also don't lose sight of the 2030 agenda because it's a climate, we have a health crisis, an economic crisis, but it's also the crisis of inequalities. We have a climate change crisis. So we really have to focus on all these different challenges that we are facing. And I think it's very important that we guide our companies, that the narrative that we are always using with our companies on the 10 principles and the SDGs, that even now in these times of crisis, it's even more important. And we see a lot of companies who are taking actions to implement and to take action towards the SDGs. And I think it's very important that we strengthen and that we also build more diverse partnerships with governments, with business associations, with civil society. And we really, as Global Compact, would like to, we will continue to play our role of platforms to bring partnerships together, to build also an environment where business that want to take steps towards more sustainability, that there is an enabling environment for them to do so. And what we see more and more is that more and more business see that it's important that the profit and profit, purpose, and principle, they all go together. It's not an or story, it's really an and story. And we see that a lot of businesses see that, and we just have to make sure that we build the partnerships to give them the opportunity to take leadership in this environment. Now, just very practically, what the Global Compact is doing, just to also show to business what is possible, what are good practices, what are good case studies. We have launched in March, first of all, our special appeal to business to respond to the crisis, to show to business that the 10 principles are a guide to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, together with the 17 goals, the 17 SDGs. In this special appeal, there are already concrete actions that we ask our companies to take. It's a call to action to all business. It's not only for our own 10,000 companies, it's really a call to all business. We have created some very interesting COVID impact briefs on all the topics that the Global Compact is working on. First and foremost, of course, on our 10 principles related to human rights, on labor, decent work, but also on gender equality, on climate, ocean, water stewardship, sustainable finance, and anti-corruption. All these pages are online. We have key statistics there, the challenges, what actions could be taken, but also what business is doing. It gives very concrete examples of what specific companies are doing, but there is also tools that are available that companies can use. We really play here our role of platforms. We really want to bring companies to the relevant documents that are also the tools that have been developed within the UN, but also by other stakeholders. It's really to guide business of what is possible. We also have developed 11 academy sessions. They're all recorded and you can all visit them on our website. We have developed a UN business guide on COVID-19 together with also some other UN agencies. And of course, we had the big UN Global Compact Leaders Summit. We celebrated our 20th anniversary around the theme of Recover Better, Recover Stronger, and Recover Together. And this was a 26 hours session in which we discussed all topics. We were really chasing the sun we had a lot of regional sessions with business leaders, UN leaders, civil society. So we really had the broader stakeholder group represented here. I'm just here mentioning some of the call to actions at sectoral level, but also on teams that we are supporting, that we are initiating. You can have a look at it. It's all on these impact briefs. You can all find them there on our website. We had a climate statement. So just to show that we had already the climate statement on the 1.5 campaign that the Global Compact was initiating. But we are just showing also now to governments, a call to governments that it's even more important than ever to create that enabling environment, to give companies the space to take action. So that's for the climate. We also had one on global ocean supply chains, where there was also a specific call for business and for governments what should be done, because I think that is important. It's also a story about taking up their responsibilities. All parties have to do what they should do. It's not only about what government should do, but it's also what business could do and should do. We're also supporting the call to action in the garment industry, which was led by the ILO, in which it brings all the stakeholders together in the garment industry to protect better garment workers and to create also a better protection by social protection systems for the garment workers. And we're also supporting the statement of the action by the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, which you can also find on our website. You can find all this information there. And maybe, Linda, I will stop here to just give maybe enough time also for the other speakers, because we have a very packed agenda. Thank you, Linda. I think you're muted, Linda.
Sorry, yes. Thank you so much, Griet Kattaert. It's really impressive to see what you're all doing to bring business on board, to keep business on board during these difficult times. And thank you for giving us such a quick and comprehensive overview on that. Women's rights. I would like to give the floor to Constanza Pauciullo, who is representing the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, and Senas Kimas from Women's Major Group. And I would like to ask the two of you, how do you see that macroeconomic policies impact women's human rights and gender equality? And if you could please frame your answer in terms of what we knew before COVID-19 and the lessons learned or the new risks that have arisen since the pandemic.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you for listening to us. So I actually have a favorite quote from Eurasia Pacific's work. Macroeconomic and development policies that are not accountable to the rights of people and the needs of the planet are a threat to human rights. So before COVID, after COVID, we knew this all along. But what we've also known all along, thanks to the extensive work of feminist economists, is that macroeconomic policies have direct impact on women's lives and gender equality. Even though, we seem to be talking about numbers, methods, projects, but those numbers actually represent people and the lives affected by these policies, and gender equality and women's rights is one of those areas that actually remind this to us again and again. Feminists have shown that the current macroeconomic situation undermines women and girls' rights due to reasons such as narrow and human rights blind macroeconomic goals, gender biases in macroeconomic data collection, analysis, and policymaking, insufficient focus on decent work, failure to maximize fiscal space for women's rights and gender equality, and absence of women's voices in political and economic decision-making, such as the right to unionize and undertake collective bargaining. So it's actually fair to say that feminists knew the impact of macroeconomic policies on women in all of its aspects prior to the COVID-19 crisis. But we hope that the rest of the world is also able to see more clearly now the disadvantaged position of women as a consequence of the current macroeconomic policies, and which is, worse, is exacerbated by the crises amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Before the pandemic, we already knew that women undertook an overwhelming part of the care work necessary to sustain the economy of our world. The pandemic made this more visible and unfortunately further increased it many times over, causing women to oftentimes withdraw from public paid employment. We have already started seeing the results of this. The numbers are unfortunately dropping. We see more productivity by, even in academia, right? We see more productivity from male academicians than female academicians during times of COVID. But how is it related to macroeconomics? It's related to macroeconomics decisions and policies that in the end actually know and trust that women will pick up the increased burden of care work when they have to. Women fill the gaps that's there in care services and care work, which results from underfunded public services such as health, water and sanitation, and social services, to give just a few examples. Most of our current macroeconomic policies, unfortunately, and programs are built in such a way to trust that women will come to the rescue and fill these gaps when they happen. That's why, as we move away from essential public services, for example, towards privatization, or use these public services as the first budget items to be cut during austerity measures, we actually end up increasing the care burden of women, knowing that they will pick it up. But this results in keeping women away from public life and paid employment and confining them to the traditional gender stereotypes and gender inequality within our societies. Women, particularly those from groups that suffer from intersectional and multiple forms of discrimination and marginalization, bear a disproportionate burden of both the social and economic fallout from the pandemic. They make up the majority of the workforce in the most affected sectors. Women were already overrepresented in underpaid, precarious, and informal jobs before the crisis, placing them at a greater risk now, and often meaning that they won't be qualifying for the emergency economic recovery measures taken under COVID-19 pandemic. It's therefore essential, we insist, that feminist, women's and girl-led organizations, workers' associations, and other civil society groups that represent girls and women are involved in the design and assessment of macroeconomic policies and social protection mechanisms to ensure that a gender analysis is incorporated to these policies throughout, explicitly asking this question: what are the effects of these policies on women, on girls, on non-binary folks? And what are the systemic, not just cosmetic, but systemic root causes and systemic changes we need to undertake in fiscal policy, expenditure policy, in tax, labor market policies, and other macroeconomic policies to ensure that we build back to a world of equality and justice for all, rather than to a broken normal one. Thank you. Linda, you're muted again.
Sorry, I forgot my mic. Thank you so much, Kimas from Women's Major Group. My next question is for Constanza Paciullo from International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. And Constanza, in a minute, you're also going to present us some tools that relate to CEDAW and the SDGs. But what I wanted to ask you is, how can we connect the SDGs and international human rights frameworks to strengthen accountability for women's human rights and gender equality? Constanza.
Thank you very much for the question, and hello to everyone here with us today. I'm very happy to be here with you. If I may just take a really quick detour to build off Sahanas's really helpful explanation of the impact of economic policies on women's human rights, and also add to the interesting discussion earlier on just transitions, I'd like to say that really a feminist human rights-based approach to the SDGs is essential if we're going to achieve the transformative level of just transition mentioned earlier in the discussion, and one that really rejects the status quo, pushes back on private sector dominance in decision-making spaces and multilateral spaces, and that also moves beyond the kinds of conventional approaches to economics and development that have really, for decades, if not longer, benefited a small few at the expense of a majority, with women, particularly marginalized groups of women in the global South, bearing the highest burden. So thank you to everyone for your contributions so far. I just wanted to add a little there before turning more specifically to the question on how to use human rights and the SDGs together to strengthen accountability for human rights and gender equality. And I'm going to be looking specifically at two key roles that international human rights frameworks play in connection to the SDGs. The first is that they help translate the often broad language used for goals and targets into specific gender responsive policies and action plans. So for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, includes two important standards of non-discrimination and substantive equality. These can be used to focus really all the SDGs and targets into laws, policies, and on-the-ground implementation practices that enable women's human rights while also providing a framework for transforming systems, institutions, and other structures that reinforce inequality. The second role that human rights frameworks can play relates to the fact that SDGs do not have a built-in compliance mechanisms for states or other actors who make commitments under the agenda. So the voluntary national review process actually is presented as an opportunity for states to share and learn from each other's experiences, rather than to review their compliance with international norms and standards like you might find in spaces like the treaty bodies. So by connecting the SDGs to legal human rights obligations under international treaties, or even at the national level, we can start to create inroads to various mechanisms for holding actors to account and enforcing SDG commitments, all of which bring us closer to achieving the full vision of Agenda 2030. And to illustrate this whole point, if I may borrow an example from the Center for Economic and Social Rights that I've found really helpful and relates specifically to SDG 10 on reducing inequality within and among countries, and even more specifically, target 10.4, which requires, quote, the adoption of fiscal, wage, and social protection policies and progressively achieve greater equality, end quote. So this target doesn't provide a lot of guidance on what kinds of policies should be adopted, nor does it speak to the gender impact of these types of economic policy decisions. Of course, we all know that that SDG 5 on gender equality is a cross-cutting issue for all goals, which means that a gender perspective must be applied to target 10.4. CEDAW gives us the tools for doing that by providing the normative legally binding standards to analyze new and existing economic policies to determine their impact on women's human rights and whether they promote gender equality. Two of those standards I've already mentioned, non-discrimination and substantive equality. Another way that CEDAW committee and other treaty bodies can help is in the ways that they've examined how inequality intersects across different lines of discrimination and the kinds of measures that are required to alleviate the disadvantages faced particularly by vulnerable or marginalized groups of women. And where governments fall below this mark, the review process of the CDOT committee can help fill that accountability gap. And I'll just end quickly by saying that we have seen the committee consider the gendered impact of various economic decisions, including cross-border tax policy, illicit financial flows, austerity measures, and the impact of loan conditionalities, etc. So it really, human rights frameworks in general can be a really great tool to fill out the SDG agenda. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Constanza. Thank you for that. We will hear from you also a little bit later in the tools section. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, we would like to present to you some tools that relate to this topic of the just transition and building things better during this pandemic and after this pandemic. And the speakers that we have today to present some of the tools are from the Global Reporting Initiative, from UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and from World Benchmarking Alliance. And I would give first the floor to Samista Selvaratnam from World Benchmarking Alliance. And Samista, I think you will introduce the SDG 2000. Can you tell us more about it? And maybe share your screen? Yes, that works perfectly. We can see you and we can see the screen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you for the opportunity to present today alongside a lineup of excellent panelists. A little bit of background on the World Benchmarking Alliance. We believe urgent action is needed to put the world on a more sustainable path. We believe that business have a key role to play in driving this change. And in this context, we are focused on developing benchmarks that measure and compare company performance on the Sustainable Development Goals. These benchmarks are made free and available for all and are shared with a broad set of stakeholders, including investors. In doing so, we'll create a system that recognizes leadership and creates accountability for those that continue to lag behind. WBA's movement is grounded in our alliance of over 150 stakeholders that represent a large mix of voices aligned with the universality of the SDGs. In order to incentivize greater transparency, action, and accountability from the private sector on the SDGs, we need to fundamentally transform the way business operates, which requires us to take a systems-based view that recognizes the complexity and interconnectedness of the SDGs. Our systems transformation framework that you can see up on the slide builds on previous research around the need for systems thinking and outlines the 7 transformations we believe the world must undergo and where business has a unique role to play in order to achieve the SDGs. So we view the systems as 3 concentric circles. Starting at the center, just as the SDGs place people first, our social transformation aims to put people at the heart of change so that no one is left behind as we create a better future. That is why the social transformation sits at the center of the framework. It focuses on respect for human rights, equality, and empowerment, without which none of the SDGs can be fully achieved. It aims to ensure that human rights and human development are at the center of corporate sustainability action and acknowledges that all companies have a critical role to play in ensuring social inclusion. The second level of the model focuses on thematic transformations, looking at things like digital, food and agriculture, and decarbonization and energy. And the final layer of the model focuses on the financial system, which has a dual role to play. First, in transforming itself to become more aligned with the SDGs, and second, in mobilizing the capital needed to enable the other 6 transformations. Each of these systems will include benchmarks focused on the performance of companies within specific sectors or industries. So as Linda mentioned, the SDG 2000. So across all systems, we've identified 2,000 companies that are the most influential in potentially contributing either positively or negatively to the achievement of the SDGs. These include public, private, and listed companies that span over 70 countries and make up half of the entire global economy. A quarter are based in developing, emerging, and frontier markets, and with their supply chains, they represent a truly global footprint. In order to ensure that people are at the very heart of change, WBA has committed to assess all 2,000 companies on a social element. And one way that we're doing this is through Spotlight social benchmarks that provide deep dives into specific social issues in relation to specific sectors. We are currently exploring what Spotlight social benchmarks we should develop in the future to address systemic social issues. And some initial areas of interest are racial equality, income equality, and shareholder business models. We currently already have 2 Spotlight benchmarks, one looking at gender equality and women's empowerment in the apparel sector, which will be launched later this year, as well as the corporate human rights benchmark. The corporate human rights benchmark focuses on human rights performance in high-risk sectors. This year, we'll be releasing the 4th iteration of this benchmark, and it will be released in November this year. However, in light of COVID, we've done a bit of a pivot. So we'll be benchmarking the companies, the 230 companies that fall within this benchmark on key UNGP requirements, but we're also going to be looking at their response to COVID. We'll be assessing companies on board and management oversight of their COVID response, specific due diligence measures they've put in place in response to COVID, the implementation of worker protections such as remote worker practices, improved health and safety measures, as well as the ability for workers to take sick leave. And finally, also how companies are supporting their supply chain on these issues and not cancelling orders. We'll also be assessing all 2,000 companies using core social indicators and transformation specific indicators. The core social indicators are a common set of expectations that all companies must meet to be considered responsible business actors. These will act as hurdles which companies must clear to be given credit for their contribution to the SDGs. So to take a quick example, a company that is contributing to the digital transformation by facilitating digital access and supporting the development of digital skills should not be given full credit to their contribution to the SDGs if they don't, for example, respect employees' right to freedom of association and pay workers a living wage. The transformation-specific social indicators will be used to assess companies on sector-specific social issues that must be addressed in order to enable a transformation. For example, within the food and agricultural transformation, we are likely to assess companies on managing water and land rights of smallholder farmers. This ensures that the transitions from the current system to the desired system are just transitions that leave no one behind. Coming back to the core social expectations that all 2,000 companies will be assessed on. As you see on the slide, we have prepared a list of 15 topics against which we propose to assess all companies. The expectations range from key elements of business and human rights, such as access to remedy, to things such as corporate taxation, lobbying, and anti-corruption. We are currently in the consultation phase for our social transformation, and we'd love to receive your input on the model we have proposed to assess 2,000 companies on social issues, including these topics up on the slide. We'll be holding a series of workshops later this month, as well as in August, so please reach out to us using the email address up on the slide if you'd like to give us your input. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you so much, Shamista. Thank you for all that information, and thank you for that invitation to engage with you. The next speaker today is Elena Botwina. Elena Botwina from UNCTAD. And Elena, you are going to present UNCTAD guidance on core indicators for entity reporting on contribution towards implementation of the SDGs. I can nicely see your presentation. If you can put it on full screen, we can see it even better. Elena,
yes.
You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda.
Can you put it on full screen? Would that work?
Yeah, do you see it now?
Excellent. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Linda. So the COVID-19 crisis highlighted the urgency of the SDG agenda, and we would like to share the tools that UNCTAD developed in measuring the private sector's contribution to the SDG agenda. So I'll start with the background introduction of challenges in SDG reporting by companies, and would like to disclose some of the highlights of PwC report on SDG reporting challenges that explicitly states that 72% of companies mention the SDGs in their annual corporate and sustainability reports. However, only 23% of companies disclose meaningful key performance indicators and targets related to the SDGs. And therefore, unfortunately, the score of the reporting quality is only 2.71 out of 5. UNCTAD has also identified additional challenges in this area since the existence of several frameworks and the gradual increase in the number of reporting frameworks. It leads to the lack of harmonization in the corporate reporting and results, unfortunately, in the lack of consistency and comparability of data reported by companies. Of course, we also have to admit that lack of assurance of information reported by companies undermine the reliability of this data. And we need to be careful with interpretation of the issue of materiality that has a broader definition within the context of the SDG agenda. So to address those challenges, UNCTAD developed a number of tools by the request of the Intergovernmental Working Group of Experts on International Standards of Accounting and Reporting, called ISAR. UNCTAD is the secretariat of this group, and within the context of 2030 agenda, ISAR contributes to enhancing the role of the enterprise reporting in assessing the private sector contribution to SDGs. Within the adoption of SDGs, UNCTAD focused its work on a target 12.6 that explicitly encouraged companies, especially large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices and to integrate sustainability information into the reporting cycle. Together with UN Environment, we are co-custodians of the indicator 12.6.1, the only indicator in the SDG frameworks that measures the impact of the private sector to sustainable development agenda. We were tasked to develop the measurement methodology of the indicator and also oversee the data collection and reporting process on 12.6.1 up to 2030. The metadata guidance has been successfully approved in September 2019, and now we're moving forward with pilot testing of the data collection that is expected to start in the second half of 2020. In cooperation with the global analytical data company, we have designed a data collection mechanism that you can see on the screen. It's based on the two streams of data collection. The first one is screening in-country database and global data repositories, and the second is in-depth analysis that is conducted via automated survey conducted with companies in each country. So once the data is collected, it goes through the analytical phase, data aggregation that enables reporting on VNRs and global SDG databases.
Elena, sorry, I just have a comment from the chat. If you can slow down a little bit.
Oh, yes, sure, no problem. We just have a limited time, so I try to fit all the information we want to contribute. Okay, no problem. Yeah, to support the reporting on SDGs and to assist governments to assess the private sector contribution to SDGs, UNCTAD has developed a guidance on core indicators for entity reporting. The guidance is also a practical tool for companies on how to report on SDGs. And you may find a link to the copy of the guidance on our website. The GCI framework covers 4 areas: economic, environmental, social, and institutional. It represents a limited number of core SDG indicators that have been identified based on core reporting principles, selection criteria, main reporting frameworks, and companies' reporting practices. You can see examples of some of these indicators on the screen, and the key principle is, of course, that those indicators are common for the companies of various geographies, industries, and sizes. UNCTAD's approach is built on the logical framework that connects sustainable development goals with the framework of targets and enterprise indicators. To examine the relevance and applicability of the proposed approach and to verify suggested measurement methodology and accounting data availability, UNCTAD conducted a series of case studies. Currently, we have about 15 case studies conducted in different areas and industries, including telecommunication, oil and gas, mining, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, hospitality, and others. The key finding that we have came up to is that the most of core indicators could be reported, and it was not a big problem for companies to follow the GCI framework. To further support companies on reporting on SDGs, UNCTAD released a GCI training material that gives more details on measuring methodology for the indicators and gives also the reference to the source where the data can be found. And taking this opportunity, I would like to invite all of you to our upcoming 37th session of ISAR that will take place in Geneva in November 2020. Of course, we alternatively consider online discussions, but we hope to have a face-to-face meeting. The main agenda of the session will cover the issue of selection of core indicators for entity reporting, as well as climate-related financial disclosures. And we'll also organize a technical workshop on assurance and sustainability reporting a day earlier. The session will also include a ceremony on ISAR Honors 2020. And this is an initiative, quite a young one. We're only 3 years old with this project. With an objective of this initiative is to raise awareness and facilitate dissemination of best practices on sustainability and SDG reporting by companies. So therefore, I take this opportunity to encourage you to apply for this initiative. This is the last call, and we close the applications on 15th of July. You still have some time, and I shared the link so you can find more details on qualification criteria if you would like to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elena. A lot of information in a short time. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to invite our next speaker, and that is Charlotte Portier from the Global Reporting Initiative. Hello, Charlotte. And Charlotte will present the SDG reporting tools, demonstrating how these can support business and other stakeholders in further contributing to the SDGs. Before you start, Charlotte, I would also remind some of the speakers here that you have some questions in the question and answer box. Thank you, Mustafa, for replying to many of them. I would like the others to also have a look at it, please. And Charlotte Portier from Global Reporting Initiative, you have the floor.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to be here and sharing with you some tools and advice that we've developed at GRI, which stands for Global Reporting Initiative. And we are a standard setter that businesses use to disclose and share their sustainability information. So we work with businesses to enhance their contribution to sustainability and a just economy. And this has become, as highlighted by all the other speakers, even more relevant given the current state we're in with the global pandemic. And we also work with key stakeholders that influence business decisions, such as government and investors. And we work with them through the practice of corporate reporting, which Elena just touched upon and introduced. So I will go quite quickly through this, since now you already have an idea of what is the corporate sustainability reporting. It is under one target, SDG 12.6. And we really believe that reporting can bring transparency and accountability to the business actions and impact on sustainability. It helps them manage their impact, positive and negative. And it also enables other stakeholders to rely on this information to make informed decisions, such as investors and governments again. So at GRI, we are committed to enable the private sector to identify and communicate those impacts on sustainability. We've also been engaging and trying to bring on board more and more businesses, because it is still not a general practice. And lastly, we support the reporting exercise to be aligned with the SDGs, because reporting has been around for over 20 years, and the SDGs have really brought in a new perspective that we want companies to reflect on and integrate into their strategy, into their operations, and really learn on how they can contribute to the goals. So to do this, we've developed a number of tools with UN Global Compact, and here they're presented to you. I'll start with the first one, which is the analysis of goals and targets. And in that tool, we've listed all business disclosure that are generally recognized and already used by businesses against each of the target of the goals. So businesses and also organizations that want to disclose information on their impact on the goals can go through that list and pick those indicators that are relevant to their activities. And we've also listed possible actions per target that businesses should look at or undertake. The second tool is integrating the SDGs into corporate reporting, which is a practical guide with a step-by-step process on how to integrate the goals into your reporting process. So it's not only mapping your existing impact again, the target. We really want companies to take it deeper, reflect on what those goals means for their activities. And that's what this tool really does. And lastly, we have an investor focused tool, which we drafted because the investor community is now looking more and more and asking for this kind of information from the businesses. And we wanted to enable those audiences to speak the same language and make sure businesses understand what investors want to see. So it's a clear recommendations on how we suggest businesses report on the SDGs. And lastly, we engage, so on one hand with businesses, but we also try to bring on board policymaker governments. So what are they going to do with business data and why is this important? And we've specifically look at this through the VNR process, or the voluntary national review process that governments go through to share the progress and implementation of the goals at national level. And we came up with these 5 recommendations. So the first one, we encourage governments to engage the private sector at every step of the SDG implementation. So when drafting the strategy, when reviewing the strategy, when monitoring and evaluating the progress, or when setting up new objectives for the years to come, the private sector is really important to be part of those discussions. The second one, we encourage governments to enforce and facilitate transparency and the disclosure of sustainability information through regulations, guidance, programs where they help companies to understand what is requested from them. We think that is really an enabler. The third recommendation is that we suggest to align with existing sustainability reporting practices. A lot of businesses already report, already use certain frameworks, and in order to ensure the buy-in from your audience, from the private sector at national level, we really recommend using what businesses already do. The fourth one is to develop a measurement and monitoring system to track the private sector contribution, because it's important. It's great to have requirement regulations, but you also need to be able to monitor and know how the private sector is contributing to the SDGs, and this can really inform the decisions. And lastly, we really invite government to enable dialogue with investors, business, and policy actors to maximize the positive impact on the goals, to really see where they can strengthen collaboration and accelerate the progress on the SDGs, which we think is essential and can only do by talking to one another. So here, that was briefly our contribution. I'll check now the Q&A to see if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Charlotte Portier from the Global Reporting Initiative. And thank you also for checking the Q&A. Now, talking about tools, I want to once more give the floor to Constanza and Senas, because you have developed some tools that specifically help NGOs to link their SDG advocacy to women's human rights and gender equality. Constanza, Senas, who of you is going to present that?
I'll go first.
That's you?
And,
okay.
Yeah, so I'll just share my screen.
Excellent.
Okay. So as you can see, in order to help with this harmonizing of human rights framework and the sustainable development framework that I discussed earlier, ERA Asia Pacific has come up with a tool for women's rights groups, civil society, and others to help make it easier to make those links and also to build complementary analysis with both frameworks. And while we focus on CEDAW for quite a bit of our work, the tool itself can be used with any human rights framework, either at the international or national level. And what I've done here is just list a couple examples of how the tool can be used. So the first one relates to incorporating SDGs into shadow reports or other reports within the UN human rights system. Likewise, you can start incorporating more human rights centered approaches to review and consultation processes for the SDGs. The tool can also help with advocacy around how states can use the SDGs to accelerate achieving human rights obligations, especially for women and other marginalized groups of people. The tool itself is an online Excel workbook that has some columns for organizing information and analysis, along with explanatory notes and examples to guide folks in using it and trying to identify what information to use. Again, I've kind of summarized what those columns contained. And so it's some of the things you might expect, which is, space to identify human rights issues that are key to your concerns or advocacy, space for treaty articles and corresponding SDG targets and indicators, some spots for situation analysis, developing advocacy messages, and of course, recommendations. So what I've done here with this slide is just take a screenshot of a section of the tool to make it a little bit visually easier to see in this format. And so this is about, I think, 7 of 12 columns. And as you can see along row 3/4 is the categories of information that I mentioned earlier in terms of the type of information that folks should be thinking about when preparing a report or an advocacy plan, integrating the two frameworks together. And then we have the explanatory notes in italics in the next row, which also include practical tips and references to other resources that may be helpful. And on the online version, that row 6 also includes some examples to help people out even further. Another resource that may be helpful for people who are using the tool for the first time is to take a look at a report that has used the tool specifically to develop its analysis and recommendations. And this is one example of that kind of report. It was developed in 2018 by the General Union of Palestinian Women and the Non-Governmental Women Coalition for the Implementation of CEDAW in the Occupied State of Palestine, with the support of Eurasia Pacific. As I said, it used the tool to develop its analysis and recommendations, and was presented at the first VNR of the State of Palestine and the inaugural state report of Palestine before the CEDAW committee. Here I've just set out the main sections of the report to hopefully start giving you a sense of the connection between the categories of information that we talked about earlier and how they got put into or formatted and incorporated into the report itself. So we start with a contextual or a situational analysis. And then feminist and women's rights groups from Palestine identified 3 key human rights thematic areas that they wanted to address. And under each of those areas, there's an analysis of the human rights obligations and corresponding SDGs. So these next 3 or so slides, I had gone into the right to health as an example to show in a little bit more detail how that analysis was done. But in the interest of time, I won't go through it other than to just show you this next slide, which is, again, another screenshot of a portion of a chart that was used under each of those 3 priority human rights areas to demonstrate or to lay out the analysis and the links between the human rights obligations and the SDGs. And as you can see, the columns and the categories correspond very closely to the tool, so you start to get a sense of how this is working in practice. And then this is some of the conclusions that were drawn on the right to health that were in that right-hand column. But I think rather than end on this, I did want to end on a more general message that's actually found at the beginning of the report, and I'll just quote it. It goes as follows. The grounding of development priorities in human rights is a legal, political, and moral imperative, and is the only way to achieve the transformational rhetoric of the 2030 agenda of leaving no one behind by reaching the most vulnerable and marginalized. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Sehenes now.
Thank you, Constanza. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you.
That's where we are a little bit late because I do have some questions lined up. So yeah, if you can keep it short.
Thank you. It's only 2 slides. So I just want to talk about the tool we have for our members, but any women's rights organization, and it's actually very useful for any civil society organization who wants to engage in the voluntary national review process. That, you know, the process is formed as the accountability process for the SDGs, but as Constanza have mentioned, needs a lot of support to go beyond the peer, you know, review and solidarity agenda that it sets out to be. So it goes through why engage with a VNR process, how to engage in the official process, what CSOs can do if they cannot connect with the official process, and how to follow through that VNR doesn't end at HLPF, but it's actually a circular process like the human rights institutions. It should be a circular process like the human rights mechanisms before, and where to find information and resources. Could we go again, Constanza, to the next slide? Thank you. So just a note from there to show the connections between the issues is that an example is the alternative reports, which are not official in the SDG sense, as you know, but are actually very helpful. It provides a platform whether or not you're able to get in touch with the official process as well, because it provides a platform to work across civil society organizations, creates opportunities to engage with the government, helps determine a baseline to measure change over time, generates information and analysis to use in advocacy and media work, and helps to identify gaps and deficiencies in government policies and programs. So if you're engaged in other types of reports, international reporting, such as to the CEDAW committee, you may be able to use this information in the VNR shadow reports as well, and vice versa. So this cross-pollination is something that's crucial to make sure that the SDGs and Agenda 2030, which is the agenda for people, by people, actually delivered to the people through inclusion of civil society and the voices of the most marginalized in them all the time. Constanza, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So this presentation I know will be shared on the website. You can see more information, and you can see also our color campaigns from the social media that became a tradition. This is our 5th year. And today, actually very fittingly, our theme is climate change and the just transition from fossil fuels. Thank you.
Linda, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I tend to forget that. Thanks for those great presentation of the tools. We are already close to the end of the session, but there have been an amazing amount of comments and questions, both on the chat and on the Q&A. Too many to answer for sure, too many raised hands to answer for sure. But when looking at the chat, there's really 2 items that come up over and over again. And one is the question of, you know, this just transition, fine, nice, but is it compatible with the economic challenges that developing countries are facing? And maybe, Mustafa, that is something you want to briefly talk about and respond to that question. The other one is, are businesses really going to behave differently after this COVID crisis? And nice that we're all engaging with business, wonderful, but how do we actually hold them accountable? I think these are 2 questions that I really see come up. I have a couple of raised hands, and I wanted to give the floor to 2 people who have really raised their hands already for quite a while, and that is Erika Kasongo, I think you're calling in from Kinshasa, and David Oshota. Are you still with us? Eric, I'm going to try to give you the floor here. Let me see if I can unmute you. Whoa. Or are you already unmuted, Eric? Let's see if that works. Oh. Otherwise, David, are you unmuted? No, you're not. I think I need to do something from my end to make that happen. If not, Mustafa, maybe you want to go ahead. And in the meantime, I let these two participants prepare their question.
Well, thank you, Linda. If I understand correctly, the question we're having is whether a just transition is relevant in the context of developing countries or not.
Exactly. Is it compatible with other challenges?
Yes. Well, of course, colleagues will also come in to answer the question, but my sense is that what we mean by just transition is how do we make, enable the international community that has committed to a low carbon and a climate resilient development trajectory, both through the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals, to do that in a way that not only advances the environmental and climate objectives, but also the social dimension, social inclusion, economic development, income generation, employment creation. For me, this other dimension of job creation, social inclusion is fundamental for developing countries. You know, if I put ahead my UN hat and speak from a national from Africa, development is central, but we understand that development must be sustainable. You cannot undermine your natural capital, your human capital, and expect to have anything that will reduce poverty and reduce inequalities. So therefore, it's about how to advance the environmental and climate agenda on one hand, but do that in a way that also takes us forward when it comes to job creation, social inclusion, maximizing the gains, minimizing the losses. You know, I think this is an agenda for developing countries.
Excellent. Thank you, Mustafa, for that. Now the other one, we engage, but how do we hold accountable? Does anybody want to, Charlotte?
Yeah, happy to
yeah,
come
Charlotte,
in a
please.
little bit. That for us, we can bring accountability by having those requirements of reporting. And then there was a bit the question, how are we sure that what companies report is actually their impact, or what is it true? And I think that's where a bit there's the challenge at this stage. Assurance providers do play that role where they can say this is the right data and sign it off. But it's a bit of that trust that we put in companies to take this seriously and report and change their practices that are negatively impacting people and the planet. And that's what we hope to do through reporting, and what different organizations that are also today presenting, we're all working towards transparency, bringing accountability, in making sure it helps businesses manage their impact, because sometimes a large company doesn't even know the impact they have in certain small countries. How can they have oversight of all their activities when now we have such large ones? That is very complicated, but it's also what we want and what everyone wants. So hopefully the rising of such regulations will help that, and all the tools that are now have been developed by organization. There is no more excuse to not look at it, let's say. So that's our wish.
Sina, if I may just comment on this one, UN Global Compact, we are also, because what we see is there is a fast evolving reporting landscape. Also, more governments are setting legislation on reporting. So we as Global Compact are also reviewing our communication on progress framework. So that's the main communication of our participants, how they are performing. So we are having now very broad consultations to make sure that we really align with existing frameworks, initiatives, benchmarks. We're not going to invent something new, but we really want to align with others to make sure that all our 10,000 companies are reporting more transparent, and that we can make them more accountable for what they're doing against our 10 principles and the SDGs more in general. So we are in the process of reviewing it, and it will be launched next year. I think many of you are in the consultation process, so.
Yeah.
Linda, if I may add from the UNCTAD perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as business is a very important player of the SDG agenda, we believe that it's not only about supervising and measuring the contribution of business, but also to support them with understanding what is really expected and to provide very clear guidance on, in that particular case, harmonized and comparability reporting. So it's more like a technical assistance that is really required.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes.
Sorry, just add for 2 sentences on it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's great to have accountability from all of the partners, but I think we should also remember that the member states are actually the parties of the United Nations and have committed to the Sustainable Development Agenda. So we should also make sure, I think, that we shouldn't forget the accountability on the part of the member states, which the COVID-19 crisis has actually shown us are very much interconnected. And the need for United Nations and multilateralism and global action and being accountable to each other of the countries is very crucial and central to the Agenda 20. And we shouldn't, forget to mention it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senas. Thank you for that. Now, I was looking at the raised hands of our 300 or something participants. They come and go a little bit. And we are out of time. And it's not the last session today, so I think we need to call it a day. I would like to to thank the organizers for this session. I would like to thank all of the speakers from the many organizations that are behind this. And I would like to thank especially the participants that have been with us today. I hope the tools that we presented today, the ideas that we transmitted today are useful in your work and bring us a little bit further towards the goals that we have in mind here on the just transition in this period of COVID and the economic recession that comes with it. So thank you very much. Harris, I think we are closing. Anything you want to add from your side?
I just want to say that on behalf of all the participants and the panelists, thank you, Linda, for organizing this morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are, and for moderating it so well. And thank you for all the panelists and the participants for your wonderful questions and your presentations.
Thank you. Bye-bye, and hope to see you soon.